Thanks very much, Kirsten. And thanks very much to Zani and Tun Kin and all of the organisers of this event. I think one of the things that has struck me is actually when you start talking about what's happening to the Rohingya in Burma, how few people actually understand what's going on or have even heard about the Rohingya. So I think what's required is a sort of a full frontal assault in as many ways as possible. And this conference, I think, represents an incredibly important beginning, let's say, to the next phase.
One of the things that has struck me.
Have I got feedback? I'm going to speak very briefly. I know that we're very pressed for time. I want to locate the persecution of the Rohingya within a state crime paradigm. I'm a criminologist, and that's the field in which I'm operating. And I think it's a paradigm which does help frame Myanmar state policy towards the Rohingya as genocidal, particularly if we understand genocide or the final end stage of genocide as part of a continuum which begins often with processes of dehumanization, etc., that we've heard earlier this morning. And this paradigm also speaks to the centrality of civil society in defining and challenging crimes committed by states. I'm currently leading an ESRC-funded research project, a comparative study into resistance to state violence across 6 different jurisdictions, and Myanmar Burma is one of those countries. And that's largely why I've become involved in the Rohingya question, though I haven't done any explicit research at this point. The core examples of state crime are generally easy to recognise, at least if we think about genocide, at least the end stage of genocide, war crimes, torture, police violence, state corporate crime, grand corruption, and so on. But exactly how state crime should be defined is actually a controversial question. And dissatisfied with legal definitions, for the obvious reason that states are very unlikely to legislate against their own behaviour, my colleague Tony Ward from the University of Hull and I developed a definition of state crime which captures the sometimes veiled and not always legally prescribed deviance of the state. And that definition is state organisational deviance involving the violation of human rights, so defined by a social audience. For us, that social audience is civil society, inasmuch as it is central, as we saw this morning, and particularly thinking about Jani's presentation on people's tribunals, is central to defining, labelling, exposing and resisting illegitimate state practice. Now, the boundaries between legitimate and illegitimate state violence and financial dealings are not always, of course, clear-cut, and it's in drawing and contesting those boundaries that civil society plays one of its most critical roles. The most obvious reason why the concept of civil society is important in defining state crime is that, as one Burmese civil society activist put it to me, that in such a highly authoritarian regime as Burma's, state crime is the legal rule of law. And it wasn't for nothing, of course, that the regime until fairly recently called itself the State Law and Order Restoration Council. And while international law may provide a useful discursive resource, the recognition that what the state proclaims as legal is in reality crime on a grand scale, and what it defines as crime is in reality very often resistance to that crime, is essentially a matter of moral and political conscience. What's happening to the Rohingya, I think, needs to be understood in the context of the violent history of Burmese rule, and there's simply no time to go into that, but we know that Burma has a horrible history of extrajudicial killings, ethnic cleansing, torture, forced labour, the use of child soldiers, disappearances, rape, arbitrary arrests, detention, the denial of the right to fair trials, forced evictions, land grabs, and so on. During the period of the military junta, particularly from 1988 to 2011, state crime in Burma was defined by a myriad of interconnected civil society organisations, from exiled pro-democracy activists through student movements and ethnic minority organisations, as well as the opposition in absentia, those who had had to flee Burma, and media groups in particular like Burma VJ or the Democratic Voice for Burma, as well as international NGOs. And as a result of their activities, sanctions were applied to Burma for very many years. Unfortunately, today, many of those same civil society activists inside Burma, as we heard earlier, are unprepared or cannot see the persecution of the Rohingya as a human rights question. I mean, this leads people like myself into despair, however. Unfortunately, however, there are people, and there are particularly very powerful international and diaspora organisations which have exposed what's going on to the Rohingya to the rest of the world. And in that group, of course, I would include Human Rights Watch, MAT's Fortify Rights, the Arakan Project, led by Chris Lewa, the Burma Rohingya Association, and so on. And these organisations have made a fantastic difference to our understanding of what's going on. And without them, we wouldn't know what was happening inside Burma in Rakhine State. There's a uniform reluctance to designate the existence of genocide until after its occurrence, so that has tended to be the case. And while it may not appear to many that genocide is taking place in Rakhine State in the sense of the physical extermination of the whole or part of the Rohingya, I think that there's no doubt at all that the process is well underway. The country clearly demonstrates a number of red flags identifiable from the genocide literature. We heard about them this morning, so I won't go into all of them, but particularly we should be concerned with the mobilisation along lines of communal cleavage, hate propaganda, discriminatory legislation, and severe repression against the target population, in this case, the Rohingya Muslims. Perhaps of greatest concern is the evidence of a systematic attempt to exclude the Rohingya from what Helen Fine, in her work on genocide, calls the universe of obligation, and to portray them as a threat to be eradicated. These conditions grow out of a wider political, economic, and cultural set of conditions, including the presence of an authoritarian, ethnically stratified nation-state, which has a project of nation building. There's an opportunity structure and an absence of some kind of deterrent force to protect victims. The organisation which I'm a part of, the International State Crime Initiative, is currently preparing to conduct research which, on the face of it, might determine whether or not the conditions of persecution against the Rohingya have developed into genocidal practice. I think the more evidence we have, the better. I think it's pretty clear that it is happening. But I do think we need to establish on as many fronts as possible that the tipping point has been reached. Although Myanmar's Rohingya Muslim minority have historically suffered from gross persecution and the denial of basic human rights, including the right to citizenship, all of the evidence which we heard this morning suggests that persecution has intensified and that the current situation could rapidly descend into end-stage genocide. Now, I was going to say some more. The only thing I would wind up on, I think, is to say that we, the International State Crime Initiative, along with ZANI, are hoping to establish a people's tribunal into the persecution of the Rohingya. I'll be doing that from a new base, not King's College, but from Queen Mary University of London. And so that's something that we hope that we can call on you all to be involved in. But thank you.